I was trying to think of a story where the good guy won. It feels like most of the stories that I've been telling recently go somewhere along the lines of, well, it was hard and everybody was miserable, but we learned an important lesson, and isn't that really what you need to take away? And that's great, but I'd at least like to tell a couple of stories where we returned to the status quo at the end of it, where nobody was hurt, because frankly, that is a happy ending sometimes in prison, where bad stuff happened, but at the end of the day, it was okay. The best example I can think of a story where the good guys won and without hurting anybody would be whenever they tried to introduce a new food item onto the menu at High Desert State Prison. It was called textured soy protein, and it wasn't from an outside vendor that we could tell. It came in a little Dixie cup, like a little clear plastic cup, and it looked like food. It smelt like death. Until you opened up the top of the little Dixie cup, you thought that it was just normal prison food. Maybe not hot cuisine, but not bad. No, this was actual nastiness. And in order to explain why this was such a big deal, I need to talk a little bit about High Desert State Prison and Pelican Bay State Prison in California. You see, these two prisons are geographically isolated from the rest of the state. California has literally dozens of prisons and hundreds of yards between those prisons. But High Desert and Pelican Bay are special because they're set way off in the northern part of the state. They're geographically isolated. This serves a couple of real important purposes for a prison, and they're set there specifically. It wasn't just a random choice to put these two prisons out in the middle of nowhere. The Pelican Bay Shoe is where they sent all of the serious gang members whenever they rolled them up in the 80s and 90s and started handing out those indeterminate shoe terms. And one of the reasons that they sent everybody there is because it was so far geographically isolated. It makes it more difficult to run a criminal enterprise to get kites out whenever you're literally hours and hours away from anybody who can visit you or run drugs for you or anything like that. Additionally, it serves the purpose of providing employment at the prison. Prisons are hard to staff because it's a crappy job. Not many people want to work in a prison. You can imagine the moment whenever some guy that you've interacted with on a daily basis, who isn't too bad of a guy even though he's an inmate and your job is to make sure he doesn't escape, comes to you and asks for some reasonable request. Hey boss, can I get an extra blanket? It's really cold at night. I'm shivering. And you got to tell them, no, that's not my job. I don't get blankets. Put in a slip. Because if you're the officer who does get extra blankets for inmates, well, that's all you're going to do all day long. Not that specifically, but you're either a soft touch and people ask you for things and you do more than your job all day long. Or you're kind of standoffish and say, do it yourself, inmate. It's not my problem. This is a crummy position to be in, on top of the fact that all these inmates are trying to manipulate you, trick you in some way, and you may have to see somebody get killed or hurt. As a result, a prison that is built out in the middle of nowhere, well, that is the employment opportunity for people who live anywhere nearby, and they pay well. So this creates the extra benefit that the people who work there, they need the job. They're less likely to do something like smuggling contraband or assist a criminal gang because there's no comparable work in the area. The prison is the employment. The reason this is relevant to the story of the textured soy protein that they served at High Desert is because in addition to being the prisons where they set the shoes up, they had Z Unit at High Desert, which was just a new shoe, Security Housing Unit, SHU, that they built in 2005. And it was just an extension of the Pelican Bay shoe system. It was someplace to send inmates they didn't want to be in Pelican Bay. They wanted to isolate them further at another prison. Additionally, these two prisons, Pelican Bay and High Desert, they're called pilot prisons, meaning that they experiment on the inmates there. This isn't a secret. It's not something that they do covertly. It's openly accepted that Pelican Bay and High Desert are where the officers, where the administrative staff We'll try out new programs to see if they work. This isn't Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory experimentation. It's just, well, let's see what happens if we serve every inmate in the prison textured soy protein 2 meals out of 3 for a couple of weeks. Let's see how they react to it. The way that we reacted to it, and this was a group response, it wasn't one inmate or even a group of inmates, it was all the gangs, all the races came together, and whenever they served these little plastic Dixie cups of nastiness, everybody left the chow hall and hucked them against a side wall. Hundreds of them there at the end of the meal. It was disgusting and stunk. And before we get too excited about how big of a statement this was, that for days on end people were throwing food against this wall, don't imagine the cops were cleaning it up. It was the yard crew and the porters and inmate volunteers that were cleaning up the mess that the inmates had made. But it was still making a point. It was a type of hunger strike. Everybody was declaring firmly that this was not food. They weren't going to eat it. I suppose you could make an argument that people in other countries would have been happy to eat this food, that it was wasteful to just throw it away. But do bear in mind that High Desert and Pelican Bay are pilot prisons. If this had been allowed to pass, if they had replaced our meat, our peanut butter, our corn, our protein sources, beans too, I suppose, with this textured soy protein that they were experimenting with to see if it was fiscally feasible, they would have done it in the entire system, not just there at High Desert. And that would have been pretty unpleasant for everybody doing time. In a real way, it was a collective bargaining step. The inmates were, as a whole, acting in a non-violent manner to be clear as to the behavior they considered acceptable and unacceptable. Given that this was a decision made by the gangs, essentially, by the higher-ups, this is an admirable show of restraint. They had a lot of tools in the toolbox, as it were. Yes, throwing your food against the side of a building is absolutely a violent form of hunger strike. This isn't Gandhi or Martin Luther King sitting and peacefully asserting their rights. But given that blood was an actual possibility, that people could have said, well, we're not happy with this food, so we're going to stab some people instead, that is a show of restraint. And it points out to me that I'm a little unfair about gangs. All I have to say about them is gangs are negative influences on society. Criminal gangs take advantage of their members. They use them up. They take their money, their freedom, sometimes their lives, and it all goes up to make the people at the top wealthy. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not qualified to speak on gangs, especially not prison gangs. I was never a member, not a real one. I never got jumped in or promised, blood in, blood out. I was a generic wood. I was allowed to hang out with the cool kids, as it were. I was allowed to sit at the table, but I don't have any real knowledge about what it's like to be a part of one of these groups. And some of the stories that I've heard are very negative. Some of the stories I saw were very negative. But I've also heard positive stories about people who thought their lives were over, who didn't know what they were going to do whenever they were young, who got taken in and treated like family and given opportunities. And while I still have the opinion that gangs, especially prison gangs, are a strong negative influence in so many ways, and I don't think that's a controversial opinion, I do want to point out that this story is a perfect example of people with power and the capacity for violence asserting their rights in a peaceful and reasonable manner, and it worked out. They got rid of the textured soy protein. They did replace it with something new that looked very similar, and it still came in the crummy little Dixie cups, and anybody who's done time in the past decade has probably seen this stuff. Sometimes it's tuna, sometimes it's a roast beef type of thing. It all looks and tastes like cat food, but they only serve it like once a week or twice a week or every once in a while. The plan had been 2 meals a day, 5 days a week. And the prison gangs are the one who stood up about that. So, in your everyday life, heck, in my everyday life too, try not to judge too quickly whenever you see somebody that's obviously a negative influence. Maybe they do some good too. It doesn't make up for the bad they do. We don't get a pass for doing bad because we do good. On the other hand, don't judge too quickly. Thank you for listening today.